Hey, if you want to learn how to make a simple enemy in Unity, stay tuned. Here we are in Unity, where I have prepared this scene with an animated player character who can take damage from this enemy on the right when he touches it. If you would like to learn any of the things I used to create this scene, just take a look around my channel. Alright, let's jump right into it. We first create an empty game object as a child of the enemy. We will use this game object later to detect the player. And now we'll create an enemy attack script where I create 6 variables. Movement speed will determine how fast the enemy can move. Player position is a transform which we will use to store the position of the player in. Search radius is a number which will set the range in which the enemy can see the player. Search radius position is a transform which will contain the position of the enemy's search radius. Player mask is a layer mask, and the layer mask is used to clarify that a certain object is of a certain type. And finally, player found is a bool which will decide if the enemy sees the player or not. Okay, now let us finally begin with programming the enemy. And to do that, just go into the update function where we'll first deal with finding the player's position. And we will do this with the GameObject.findGameObjectWithTag function. This function searches a game object with a certain tag in the scene, and we can now combine this with the .getComponentTransform function to grab the transform of the player. As the tag, I simply choose player. Okay, now we will deal with detecting if the enemy can see the player. And we will do this with the good old trusty physics2d.overlapCircle function, which checks if a radius at a certain position overlaps with a collider of a specific layer mask. And if it's overlapping, the bool player found gets true. And if the enemy sees the player, will just transform its position towards the player's position with the movement speed times time delta time. Time.delta time simply makes sure that the game runs at a constant speed regardless of lag. And lastly, I'll just add the onDrawGizmoSelected function, which will make it so that we can see the enemy's view field in the scene. Alright, now we'll go back into the scene and give the enemy attack script. After that, we click on the player and give him a new layer, which we'll name player. I've prepared one beforehand. But always make sure that the collider is attached to the game object, which will give a layer mask, otherwise it won't work. Then we'll also give the player tag, but be careful because the tag has to be spelled exactly as we had written it in the code. Okay, and now we'll click back on the enemy and drag in the player detector game object, select the right player mask and adjust the search radius. And we can now test this. If we go closer towards the enemy, it will eventually see us and move towards us. But there is still a small problem, which is that the enemy won't turn towards the player if we walk behind him. So let's fix this now. I will now create 2 bools, one to determine whether the enemy faces left and one to determine if the player is on the left side of the enemy. Now we will go down inside the if expression where we compare the positions of the enemy and the player in order to decide if the player stands to the left or to the right of the enemy. And then we will add 2 more if expressions to determine if the enemy has to turn. For example, if the player is to the left of the enemy but the enemy faces right, it should turn. And the turning is done by grabbing the scalar of the enemy and reversing it on the x-axis and applying it back on the enemy. Alright, I have now added a few animations to the enemy just to make it juicier, and we are now done, so let's test this. If I was able to teach you something, please be so kind and hit me with a thumbs up. And if you would like me to cover a different topic in the future, just write it down in the comments. And then till then, see you next time.